Hi, my name is Everlyn Miller, 29 years old, the child in the family who has never once been truly valued. While my sister has always been praised as the golden star and my younger brother has been given every advantage by our parents, all I ever received were frowns and criticism. Even on my mother's birthday, when I stood up to present the most meaningful gift of all, covering the cost of the entire lavish dinner, the family still laughed, mocking me for pretending to have money. Have you ever been dismissed and denied your worth by your own family? Share your story with me and let me know where you are watching from before we begin. Thank you so much. The private dining room at Maple and Vine in downtown Chicago glowed beneath a high crystal chandelier, its light reflecting off pure white tablecloths and vases of carefully arranged white roses in the center of each table. The luxurious atmosphere carried the distinct air of American high society, making everyone who stepped inside feel just a little smaller before its refinement. Waiters dressed in black suits moved quietly like shadows, leaving only the sound of wine being poured and the faint aroma of fine roasted meat that had just been served. I sat at the far end of the long table, looking around with a feeling that was both strange and familiar. This was my mother Patricia Miller's 58th birthday, a woman always regarded as the heart of the family, and in many ways, she deserved that role. Tonight, she wore a modest navy blue dress, accented by an old pearl necklace she reserved for only the most special occasions. The golden light illuminated her face, making her smile even more radiant, yet I knew in those eyes the pride was always directed toward my sister Sloane, while indulgence was reserved only for my younger brother Noah. Beside my mother sat my father, Richard Miller, still carrying the stern presence of a businessman long accustomed to power, even though he was now retired. He sat with his back straight, his cold eyes always assessing, comparing each of his children one by one. Across the table was Sloane, my sister, sitting beside her boyfriend Derek. At 32, Sloane was already a successful attorney, walking with the confidence of polished high heels, constantly praised as the golden star of the family. My parents spoke of her as proof of their successful parenting, and she never missed a chance to remind everyone that she was their pride. My younger brother Noah had just completed his MBA. He had yet to achieve anything remarkable, but our parents provided him with everything. To them, Noah was the heir, the final hope of the family line. And then there was me, Everlyn, 29 years old, forever a shadow, the invisible child in this household. I had grown used to silence whenever I entered a room, used to my parents' distracted gazes, and used to hearing their praises always directed at Sloane or Noah. The evening began with extravagant gifts. Sloane carefully pulled out a signature orange box, and when my mother lifted the lid, the table erupted in gasps. A Hermes handbag, the kind of treasure most middle-class women only dared to dream of, now rested in my mother's hands. Her face lit up with emotion, her eyes shimmering as if she had just been handed the whole world. Immediately after, Noah stood, a little awkward but trying to mask it with confidence, and presented my mother with a small velvet box. Inside was a gleaming gold necklace. "I thought you might like this," he said, while my father nodded with pride, not even mentioning that the money had come from the account he and my mother had transferred to Noah just a week earlier. My mother threw her arms around him, tears sliding down her cheeks as she whispered her thanks over and over. I sat in silence. In front of me there was no box, no elaborate wrapping paper, only a half-empty glass of wine. My father frowned, his voice roughened by red wine. "Everlyn, didn't you prepare anything for your mother?" Every gaze at the table turned toward me. I drew in a deep breath, rose to my feet, and spoke in a calm, steady tone. "My gift is this entire evening. I want to cover the whole dinner so that Mom has a truly special memory." The atmosphere froze for a moment. My father's brows knit tighter, his eyes sharp with disbelief as if he could not trust what he had just heard. My mother hesitated, her smile flickering with a mix of joy and worry. "Are you sure? This is a very expensive restaurant," she said softly, as though afraid I might be pushing myself too far. Across the table, Sloane curled her lips into a faint smirk, shooting Derek a glance full of meaning only those certain of victory would dare exchange. Noah leaned back with a crooked grin, his eyes half scornful, half amused, as if waiting for me to humiliate myself. Only the waiter standing nearby nodded politely, his voice warm with respect. "A wonderful gesture, miss." A familiar voice echoed inside me. I knew what would come next. In this family, any effort from me was always treated as a performance, a joke. Yet, despite that, I still wanted to see my mother smile at least once in my life because the gift came from me, not from Sloane or Noah. I raised my glass, joined the chorus of congratulatory laughter, and looked at the flickering candle atop the birthday cake set in the center of the table. But in that moment, I caught Sloane's eyes. She looked at me with a tilted smile, the corner of her mouth curved with contempt. Then, in a steady voice that only I seemed to hear as anything more than casual, she said, "Stop pretending you have money, Everlyn." She did not shout and did not need to make a scene. She simply said it quietly so the whole table could hear. The weight of that sentence struck me like an invisible slap. My heart sank, and my hand trembled so slightly that my wine glass nearly slipped. Noah immediately seized the opening, his tone laced with arrogance like a newly minted prosecutor. "How do you plan to pay for this bill?" he asked, and the table exploded into laughter. Even Derek, whose presence was otherwise irrelevant, smirked in amusement as if watching a trivial performance. The laughter echoed through the private room, bouncing off the polished wood walls and pushing me into a dark corner where every beam of light seemed aimed at exposing my helplessness. My father, the man I had secretly hoped would at least stop this humiliation, merely shook his head, took a sip of his wine, and said flatly, "Everlyn, don't put on a show. This is not the time for theatrics." My mother lowered her eyes, avoiding mine, her voice meant as advice but landing like a verdict. "Sweetheart, you know this restaurant is expensive. Don't make a fuss." In that moment, I realized a glaring truth. No one in my family was on my side. They did not believe me, they had never believed me. And perhaps they never would. I tried to keep my breathing steady so the remaining wine in my glass would not tremble too noticeably. But inside, old memories rose like violent waves crashing onto the shore. I remembered summer afternoons when Sloane would wear a brand new princess dress while I had to wear a worn-out one handed down. I remembered the day Sloane received a car to go to college while I was given a second-hand laptop that had already belonged to Noah. Every gift, every compliment, was directed to them. And I, even though I had won a full scholarship and worked 3 jobs to pay my tuition, was still, in my parents' eyes, merely adequate, never good enough to be called their pride. The laughter around me began to blur, mixing with memories of my father's clipped remarks. "Sloane is the role model to follow." Or the time Noah passed a small exam and my mother threw a celebration, while when I won a national award I received only a perfunctory congratulations. When did my presence become a joke, a void everyone casually filled with contempt? I looked straight at Sloane. She sat there, immaculate in a precisely tailored black dress, her eyes shining with satisfaction. That look was exactly the same as when I was in high school when she was the star on stage and I was the one packing up the props behind the scenes. I wanted to say something, to argue back, but my throat felt strangled. I had spent my childhood with this feeling stripped of a voice, forced into silence to keep the family peace. Part of me wanted to stand up, leave the table, and walk away from it all. But another part screamed, "No, not this time." I would not let them make me a laughingstock again. I breathed in deeply, pushed the painful memories back, and held my gaze steady so the tears would not fall. My inner voice whispered, "They think I am pretending, they think I am not enough. But I know the truth. And that truth is about to speak for itself." The room buzzed with laughter around the table, but to me it felt like a distant echo, empty and meaningless. I sat still, my hand resting lightly on the leather wallet beside my chair, the one thing tucked inside that would change the color of this entire evening. I knew then that the real battle was only just beginning. Laughter had barely died down when Derek, Sloane's boyfriend, leaned toward me. He wore a light gray plaid suit and a neatly tied blue tie, his face the confident expression of someone accustomed to numbers and power. As a senior banker, Derek carried the arrogance his profession afforded. He tapped his fingers lightly on the table, his eyes skimming me as if assessing a suspicious credit file. If you really have the money, Everlyn, show everyone your account, or are you just putting on a play whose ending everyone already knows? Those words landed like another blade added to the contempt already filling the room. I heard Noah snort, his voice pouring gasoline on the fire. Or are you planning to pay with coupons? In MBA, we call that creative financing. The table broke into scattered laughter again, mixed with looks of glee. My father quietly adjusted his jacket, saying nothing, but his eyes clearly agreed with Derek. My mother, instead of putting an end to the taunting, only sighed softly, as if she had grown used to me being the target of ridicule. I sat still, my back straight, my gaze fixed on Derek. Childhood memories surged back, the times I was made to explain a small shopping bill while Sloane and Noah were never questioned. The need to prove my worth to my family had been etched into me. But this time I did not want to speak much. I was tired of defending myself with words. Instead, I chose to act. I slowly opened my leather wallet and pulled out a black titanium card, heavy in the hand and sharp along the edges. The light from the chandelier glinted off the metal surface, and for a brief moment, the entire table stilled. No explanations, no defenses. I simply handed the Amex Centurion black card to the waiter standing nearby. Charge the entire dinner to me. My voice was calm, not raised nor lowered, just steady enough for the whole room to hear. The atmosphere shifted instantly, the earlier noise collapsing into tense silence. I could feel every pair of eyes locked onto the card now resting in the waiter's hand. The quiet was so sharp I could even hear the faint clink of a wine glass being set down on the wooden table. Derek blinked, his earlier confidence faltering for a second before he regained composure with a thin smile. He shrugged, feigning expertise. A black card? You can buy one off eBay these days. A few $1,000s and you've got yourself a replica to show off. That. Sloane laughed, tilting her head against Derek's shoulder, her voice dripping with mockery. Exactly. Remember last year when the papers reported on those kids renting black cards to scam fancy restaurants? Maybe Everlyn picked up the same trick. Her lips curved in a sly smile, as though she already held the winning hand. Noah straightened in his chair, resting his arm on the table, and added another bitter jab. Let's hope the POS machine here doesn't catch you trying to use a fake card. My father only shook his head slightly, his eyes heavy with disappointment. My mother remained silent, though unease flickered clearly in her gaze. I did not argue. I had no need to say another word. I glanced at the waiter, who hesitated briefly with the card in his hand before nodding and quickly leaving the room. In that instant, every eye turned toward me, as though this were a secret courtroom awaiting its verdict. I could hear my heartbeat, steady yet weighted, pulsing against the tense silence that now filled the lavish room. Inside, I knew this was no longer about paying for a meal. This was a test, an opportunity to prove that I was no longer the invisible Everlyn of the past. Yet, at the same time, I understood something deeper. Whether the card was accepted or not, they would still find a way to belittle me. They always had, and perhaps they always would. But this time, at least, I would let the truth reveal itself instead of running away. A moment later, the dining room door opened quietly and the waiter stepped inside. His face was tense, his voice lowered as if afraid to disturb the formality of the dinner, yet his words rang clearly in the silence that had swallowed the room. I'm sorry, the card could not be processed. Albert. In that instant, I felt the space around me tighten, as though every crystal chandelier above had focused its light directly onto me. Time seemed to pause for several seconds before explosive laughter erupted across the room. Noah was the first to laugh, his voice booming as if he had just witnessed the performance of a lifetime. Sloane nearly clapped her hands in delight, her eyes gleaming, her wide grin stretching until her cheeks flushed red. Fake black card, she practically shouted, her voice cutting above every other sound. This is the real Everlyn, always just a pretender. Derek laughed too, a quiet but scornful chuckle, then leaned towards Sloane and murmured, Told you, the card's definitely a knockoff. You can tell at a glance. Sloane nodded in agreement, her eyes on me as if I had just slipped the noose around my own neck. Beside her, Noah clicked his tongue and deliberately raised his voice so the entire table could hear. Pathetic. If you don't have it, fine. But to pretend and show off? That's embarrassing. My father leaned back in his chair and sighed heavily, one hand pressed to his forehead as if bearing my shame for me. My mother flushed, awkwardly looking around to avoid anyone's eyes, her hands clenched together on her lap. She seemed as if she wanted to disappear right then, to avoid facing the scene of her daughter being exposed before the whole family. In those moments, I heard the harsh laughter echoing in my head, mingling with the pounding of my heart. I remembered the countless times in the past I had been labeled the same way, a pretender, a failure, not good enough. I remembered in high school when I received a statewide commendation and my father said, "Good, but Sloane earned this too." I remembered being accepted to university on a full scholarship and my mother replying, "Not like Noah, he gets everything taken care of by his parents." Those memories surged back like waves, crashing over me and drowning me in a sea of mockery. I sat motionless, my hand still on the table, curled into a fist to stop my body from trembling. Part of me wanted to stand up and shout at them to admit how wrong they were, but another part urged calm. I had grown accustomed to being belittled. Their contempt was no longer new. It was a worn copy of countless moments before. Only this time, I had prepared for this moment. I did not need to argue or defend myself. I simply needed to let the truth speak for itself. I glanced at the waiter, still standing awkwardly with the card in his hand, and gave him a slight nod, as if to assure him that everything was fine. I knew what was coming. For them, this dinner was just another chance to turn me into a joke. But for me, this was the moment I had been waiting for all these years, the moment when the shell of the invisible child would finally crack and fall away. I took a sip of wine, letting the laughter echo around me, and whispered to myself, "Go ahead and laugh. In just a few minutes, everything will change." The mocking voices still hung in the air like an irritating echo when the dining room door swung open. A middle-aged man in a gray suit hurried in, his face flushed, his breathing heavy as if he had run a long way. The entire room froze, every gaze shifting toward him. I recognized him immediately. Jameson Clark, a senior manager at Maple and Vine, a man who almost never appeared unless something serious had happened. He stopped beside the table, bent slightly at the waist, and spoke with urgency and clarity. "Miss Miller, my deepest apologies. The issue is not with your card. It's because our restaurant still owes your company $550,000 from last month's catering contract." The sound in the room dropped into a void. The laughter was cut off so abruptly it left behind a suffocating silence. I heard someone gasp sharply, and when I turned, I saw the wineglass slip from Sloane's hand, crashing onto the carpet with a piercing shatter, exploding into thousands of crimson shards. She was frozen, eyes wide, lips trembling but unable to form a single word. My father's brows drew tight, his usually cold expression breaking into momentary confusion. My mother raised a hand to her mouth, her eyes darting as if searching for an escape from the stifling quiet. Derek blinked rapidly, his once confident face now clouded with bewilderment. Noah leaned forward, disbelief etched in every line of his face, his voice breaking. "Oh, which company exactly?" Jameson continued, his tone steady but edged with urgency, as though he was desperate to resolve the misunderstanding at once. Maple and Vine signed 3 major contracts with Miller Luxury Events to host our events, 2 charity galas and a VIP wedding. The total cost exceeded $600,000. We paid an advance of $50,000 and still owe $550,000, which will be cleared next quarter. Because accounting has not yet dispersed the payment, when the system flagged the card linked to the same account, it automatically showed the credit as held. The fault lies entirely with us, not with the validity of your card. I sat still, my hands resting lightly on the table, feeling the weight of every astonished stare from my family pressing down on me. None of them could react in time. Sloane bent awkwardly, scrambling to gather shards of glass as if the act itself could hide her shock. Derek spun his phone nervously in his hand, trying to search something, but his fingers shook so badly the screen kept sliding past what he wanted. Noah opened his mouth to speak, then shut it again, as if suddenly realizing that words had lost all meaning. My father was the first to break the silence. His voice came out rough, each word forced through tight lips. You said, 550,000? A contract? With Everlynn's company? He pressed down on the words, Everlynn's company, as though trying to confirm an impossible reality. Jameson nodded firmly, his eyes turning toward me with respect. Yes, that's correct. Miller Luxury Events, her company. Sir, ma'am, Everlyn delivered 3 of the most spectacular events Maple and Vine hosted this past year. Without her company, we would not have achieved record-breaking revenue last quarter. We are deeply grateful, and I personally apologize for the incident that cast any doubt on her standing. I gave a slight nod, the corner of my lips curving into the faintest smile. No explanations were needed, no defense required. The truth had revealed itself, spoken through the voice of someone completely outside of the family. All the laughter, all the mockery from just minutes ago had flipped into a cruel joke against them. I could see the change in their eyes, contempt melting into confusion, and then flickering with a shame they would never admit. My mother placed a trembling hand on her chest, her voice unsteady. Everlyn, that company is really yours? I didn't answer right away. I let the silence hang, stretching their discomfort. Silence, I realized, sometimes carried more weight than words ever could. In that moment, I no longer felt like the invisible child hidden beneath Sloane's shadow or measured against Noah's convenience. I was myself, and the truth had spoken, whether they wanted to hear it or not. I let the heavy silence linger for a few more heartbeats. Their eyes seemed to dig into me, searching for cracks, for denial, for any sign this was all some mistake. But there was nothing left to deny. I sat upright, set my glass gently on the table, and spoke with a calm yet resonant voice that filled the room still vibrating from the shock. That's right, I am the founder of Miller Luxury Events. My words struck like a bell, shattering the wall of illusions they had built around me for years. No more laughter, no more mocking eyes. Instead, a stunned silence blanketed the room. My father furrowed his brows, the lines on his forehead deepening as if he were struggling with an impossible equation. My mother's eyes widened, her hand clutching her pearl necklace as though it were the only anchor she had left. Sloane parted her lips, but no words came out, her gaze fixed on me in sheer disbelief. I continued, my voice calm, without boast or flourish, simply laying out the truth. Last year our revenue was $45 million. This year, we are on track to surpass $70 million. My clients are not only wealthy families in Chicago but also Fortune 500 corporations, political figures, and major charitable foundations. Each month we host dozens of events, from museum galas to million-dollar weddings. My team now includes over 200 full-time staff and hundreds of collaborators. I saw Derek, so often proud of his position at the bank, turn pale. He quietly pulled out his phone, his trembling fingers tapping frantically across the screen. The glow lit his face, highlighting his growing panic. Then I heard him mutter, his voice shaky but loud enough for the table to catch. Forbes 30. Under 30. Everlyn Miller. He looked up, his eyes wide, his expression a mix of astonishment and embarrassment. Sloane snatched Derek's phone from his hand and stared at the screen. Her eyes shifted, first doubtful, then stunned, and finally frozen in rigid silence. I knew she was reading the Forbes article published a year ago, the one that described me as the woman reshaping America's luxury event industry. Noah's mouth hung open as he stammered, "So, you're not just a freelancer picking up odd jobs." For years, my youngest brother had used the word freelancer to diminish me, as if my work were nothing more than a passing hobby. I met Noah's gaze and offered a faint smile. No, Noah, I was never just a freelancer, I run a company. The truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I watched my father inhale deeply, his hand on the table curling tighter into a fist. He had so often scolded me for being unrealistic, urging me to learn from Sloane and Noah. Now every one of those words was stripped bare by reality. My mother's eyes shimmered with tears, though I could not tell whether they came from emotion or shame. I continued, my tone steady. I am not boasting, nor do I need to prove myself to anyone. But since tonight everyone demanded to know how I could afford to pay for this dinner, this is the answer. I don't need loans, I don't need my parents' support, and I certainly don't need to pretend. I've walked this path on my own 2 feet. My father was the first to break the silence. His voice was low and hoarse, as if it took all his strength to force out the words. Why did you hide this from us, Everlyn? The question landed heavily, not just curiosity but tinged with hurt, as though my success without their knowledge was somehow a betrayal. I looked up at him, his eyes swirling with confusion, anger, and a hint of wounded pride. But deep down, the question didn't surprise me. It only unearthed memories I had long buried. I saw myself back at 18, the day Sloane received her college acceptance letter. My parents had gifted her a brand new car, a silver BMW gleaming under the summer Sunday. They handed her the keys with cheers and proud smiles, while I stood quietly in the corner, clutching my worn-out notebook. A month later, when it was my turn to head to college, my reward was a used laptop, its casing scratched, several keys already faded. I smiled and said thank you, but inside I knew the truth. The comparisons had never been fair. Then came Noah's turn. When my brother received his MBA acceptance letter, my parents covered his entire tuition, signed the checks in advance, and even promised to support his housing and car expenses. I can still hear my father's proud voice that day. You are the future of this family, Noah. You will carry it all. And me? I scraped together every cent of my tuition through scholarships and late-night shifts at the library. There were nights I fell asleep on the desk, teeth clenched, forcing myself to endure just so I wouldn't have to hear that familiar line again. If you were as good as Sloane, you wouldn't have to struggle like this. I turned back to my father, my voice calm but cutting. I hid it, because I knew that no matter what I achieved, in your eyes it would always be thanks to Sloane, thanks to you. Never because of me. I paused, letting the words sink in, then continued. I wanted to prove it on my own, without hearing anyone deny my effort again. I saw my mother flinch, her hand trembling against her pearl necklace. Sloane bit her lip, her eyes blinking rapidly as if refusing to face the truth. Noah stammered, starting to speak but closing his mouth quickly, his gaze dropping to the table. Derek looked at me, his eyes, for the first time, absent of mockery, replaced instead with something resembling respect. In my mind, it played like a film rewinding. Family dinners where I sat in silence while my parents showered Sloane with endless praise, lavish vacations where Noah always had a place, while I stayed behind to work extra shifts. The times I wanted to share small victories, only to hear the same reply, good, but not as good as your sister. Those wounds never healed with time. They simply lay dormant, waiting for the moment to burst open. And today, in this very room, under the stunned eyes of everyone present, I finally let them be spoken. I don't need recognition to boast, I said, my voice low but firm. I need it for myself. Because for all these years, I have been treated like a shadow. If I succeeded, it was credited to someone else. If I failed, it was called my true nature. So I chose silence. I chose to let my work and my results speak for me. Right. I sat still, took a deep breath, and began to speak, my tone as calm as if I were reading a report, though each word landed on the dinner table with the weight of stone. Last year, my company organized the fundraising gala for the Art Institute of Chicago. We built an entire indoor garden inside a glass conservatory, with lighting designed so that every frame looked like an impressionist painting. In one night, the donations surpassed $12 million, and the entire board of directors sent me personal letters of thanks. I saw my father blink, the lines around his eyes deepening, but he said nothing. I went on, my gaze fixed on Sloane. It was also my team and I who designed $1 million wedding in Miami, where the bride descended a staircase draped in white orchids, and the groom was one of the top hedge fund directors. That event was featured in both Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. What you once called a delusion has been documented across dozens of major publications. I paused, sipped my wine, and let the words settle into the silence. My mother covered her mouth, her eyes shimmering, torn between pride and shame. Derek stared down at the table, his tongue tied, no trace of mockery left. Noah sat stiffly, gripping his glass so tightly that his knuckles turned white. And Sloane, the sister who had never once looked at me as an equal, was now frozen in place. She whispered, her voice so faint it barely carried across the table. "I was wrong. All my life I thought you were just chasing illusions." I turned to meet her eyes, no longer with anger, only with calm. "What you call an illusion," I replied, "is my real life." The room fell silent, as if the very air was holding its breath. My father tapped his fingers lightly against the table, and for the first time his gaze lingered on me, not to judge, but to truly look. In that look, I saw a strange mixture: surprise, something close to pride, and, beneath it all, a heavy layer of guilt. He gave a small, wordless nod. My mother exhaled softly, her eyes brimming, as if she wanted to speak but couldn't bring herself to do it. I sat there, keeping my distance. I didn't reach for their pride, nor did I offer forgiveness. Deep down, I knew favoritism would not vanish overnight. Sloane would still be the golden star in their eyes. Noah would still be the indulged youngest son. And me, even after proving I was strong enough to build an empire on my own in this family, I would still be the one forced to carve out my own place. But the difference was this: I no longer needed their validation. I looked around the table and saw faces transforming from contempt to astonishment, from confusion to shame. They were looking at me in an entirely new way, and I knew then the power had shifted. Not because I had taken their seat, but because I had stepped out of the small circle they once tried to confine me to. Inside me, a steady voice rose. "This is the moment I've been waiting for, not to take revenge, but to remind myself that I am strong enough to stand on my own, whether they believe it or not." I lifted my head, held onto a faint smile, and stayed silent, letting the truth continue to echo in their minds. When the tension in the room finally eased, loosened by the weight of those last words, I set my glass down and looked around. Every eye was still on me, but this time no longer with contempt. There was confusion, respect, and even a trace of regret. I took a deep breath, then smiled, my voice calm but carrying clearly across the room. "Since today is Mom's birthday, I want to share one more thing. I've already planned your 40th wedding anniversary. It will be more spectacular than any event I've ever organized. I want you both to have a day truly worthy of you." The room paused for a heartbeat before breaking into gasps of surprise. My mother raised her hand to her mouth, her eyes shimmering with tears. My father straightened in his chair, his gaze trembling, and for the first time I saw him unable to mask his emotions. Noah looked up at me, his face a mixture of astonishment and unease, while Sloane sat in silence, her eyes darkened, unable to conceal the shake in her composure. "Everlyn," my mother whispered, her voice trembling as if carried on a breath, "you truly thought about this?" I nodded calmly. "I've already reserved the New York Botanical Garden, beneath chandeliers draped with thousands of flowers. A symphony orchestra will play throughout the evening, and the guests will be people you've cherished your whole lives. I want that day to become a memory you can never forget." My mother broke into tears, wrapping her arms around my father. He didn't cry, but I saw his hand trembling as it rested on her back. It was one of those rare moments when he let his vulnerability show. Derek exhaled softly, muttering under his breath, "Unbelievable." And Noah spoke slowly, his voice cracking. "You did all of that." But inside me, the quiet was of a different kind. I knew very well that no matter how magnificent a celebration I created for my parents, they would still praise Sloane more, still look at Noah with indulgent eyes. Favoritism doesn't disappear in a single dramatic moment. It seeps into every thought, every habit, every word they speak. I had no illusions that I had changed everything. I lifted my glass with a smile, joining the others. For Mom, for Dad, and for 40 years together. Around the table, every hand raised a glass. The delicate chime of crystal rang out, mingling with the shimmer of wine beneath the golden lights. In that moment, we looked like a united family, a perfect picture. But only I knew that behind the curtain, cracks still remained, ones that could never truly be erased. I sat there, sipping quietly, watching the candlelight reflected in my mother's eyes. She was moved, my father silent but deep in thought. Noah tried to appear closer, more attentive, while Sloane forced a faint smile, her shame hidden under a mask of pride. I smiled back at them all, but inside, I whispered to myself, I've done what I needed to do. I've given, I've stood tall, and I've understood one truth: I don't need to wait for them to change to be free. The toasts echoed again, glasses clinking once more. The dinner ended with smiles, but beneath those smiles I still heard it, the faint, quiet sound of cracks that would never fully heal. That night, after leaving Maple and Vine, I drove along the quiet streets of Chicago. The pale yellow glow of the streetlights spilled across the windshield, reflecting my face half composed, half weary. I didn't head straight back to my apartment but let the car drift along its familiar path. Then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, I turned down a narrow street leading to the house of my childhood, the place where I grew up, the place where the first wounds had been carved deep. The house still stood there, a two-story home painted white, encircled by a low wooden fence, its second-floor windows glowing with warm light. Everything looked so familiar I could almost hear the faint footsteps of children echoing from the past. I parked on the opposite side of the street and sat quietly, my hands resting on the wheel. Memories flooded back, vivid as if they had happened only yesterday. I remembered my mother's sweet yet biased voice each time I held onto a toy or fought for a chance. Everlyn, give it to Sloane. You're the older sister, you must sacrifice. I remembered my father's stern eyes when speaking about the future. Noah is the one who will carry this family. Don't fool yourself with illusions. Those words repeated over and over, embedding themselves in me, planting the belief that I would never be enough. I grew up lacking not in material things, but in recognition. And that absence, I carried through my youth, right up to this very day. I sighed, my gaze fixed on the window where I used to sit late at night, studying under the dim glow of a desk lamp, while laughter drifted from the living room where Sloane flaunted her awards and Noah basked in our parents' praise. A simple, bitter truth struck me. Even though I now ran a company worth tens of millions, even though I could pay for the most lavish dinners, no amount of financial success would ever fill the wound left by emotional neglect. The lack of love and acknowledgement from my family had carved a hollow space nothing else could replace. The car trembled slightly as I leaned onto the steering wheel, closing my eyes and letting the tears fall freely, without restraint. I wasn't crying for them. I was crying for the 18-year-old girl who once left this house quietly with nothing but an old backpack, for the nights I studied and worked to pay tuition, for the moments I longed to share joy but was met only with comparisons. Those tears were not weakness. They were release. I knew what I needed to do. I could no longer chase after my parents' approval, nor allow them to keep defining my worth. I needed to heal not with numbers, but by turning inward, by learning how to value myself. So I began therapy. At first, sitting across from a stranger and speaking about wounds I thought had long gone cold was difficult. But session by session, I learned how to name my feelings, how to recognize the truth. I had been emotionally abandoned, and that was never my fault. At the same time, I poured my energy into work not just to earn money, but to rediscover joy in creation. I organized events where clients left with eyes shining, galas where donations were enough to save thousands of children, weddings where families were bound together by love rather than favoritism. Each successful event, I no longer saw as proof against my family, but as part of my own healing journey. I also opened my heart to people who had never belittled me, who always called me by my name with respect, not with the label of the invisible child. I joined a community of women entrepreneurs, each with her own story of being doubted, underestimated, and then rising above. Within that circle, I found the empathy I had never known in my own family. They taught me that true strength does not come from proving yourself to those who never believed in you, but from believing in yourself. One morning, as I stepped out of a therapy session, I paused in front of a mirror. I saw my face not perfect, carrying traces of exhaustion, but also etched with resilience. And for the first time, I smiled at myself, without needing anyone else's approval. I thought, I am enough. And I will always be enough. A year later, I stood on the grand stage of the Manhattan Center in New York. Spotlights shone down on the thousands of people seated below entrepreneurs, artists, public officials, and even nurses and doctors from the Children's Hospital. Before me, a massive LED screen glowed with the words, "Fundraising Gala, Together for Children's Future." At my feet was a symbolic check for $10 million, the amount raised in a single night for the city's children's hospital. Applause thundered through the hall, wave after wave rolling forward. I bowed, a smile spreading across my face, and in that moment I realized. This was my family, the people who saw my true worth, without comparisons, without favoritism. In that moment, the memory of the maple and vine dinner flickered back. The night I was mocked when my card was declined, the night they sneered that I was pretending to have money. The night I stood tall and let the truth speak for itself. I no longer felt the sting of it. I only felt gratitude, because that was the moment that marked the beginning of my journey to choose myself. I held the microphone, my voice ringing clear. I once thought victory meant making those who doubted me regret it. But now I understand, true victory is when I no longer need their recognition. I stopped waiting. I chose myself. I chose a life where I am respected and loved. Those words were not only for the audience, but also a reminder to the girl I once was, the one who sat by the old window, clutching a dream of someday being seen. The stage lights dimmed, and the band began to play soft notes. I stepped away from the bright glow and walked toward the wings. Behind the curtain, my colleagues, the people I trusted and cherished, clapped my shoulder, embraced me, their eyes shining with shared joy. I felt free, no longer bound by any shadow. I didn't need to measure myself against Sloan or outshine Noah in my parents' eyes. I only needed to be Everlyn, and that was enough. As I walked out of the hall, I glanced up at the screen where my image still shone, standing before a sea of applause. I smiled softly, a sense of peace filling me. Victory was never about forcing a biased family to bow their heads. It was about being strong enough to walk away, free, no longer allowing them to define my worth. And if you are watching this story, perhaps you too have felt forgotten, compared, or diminished by the very people who were supposed to love you most. Believe me, you don't need to wait for them to change. What you need is the courage to change the way you see yourself. Family is not just about blood. True family is where you are respected, loved, and allowed to be who you are. The greatest victory isn't making them regret, it's being strong enough not to need their recognition at all. And when you reach that point, you'll find that freedom, peace, and happiness were never far away. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you feel connected or found a little strength in Everlyn's journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so that others may also be inspired. See you again in the next stories, posted every day here on Familial Stories Exposed.